I have white and I start with the king pawn e4. Which defense? My opponent is going to play. He plays e5. Symmetry, that's classic. Knight to f3 to attack the pawn, of course. Knight to c6, he defends. And now I'm going to play. The Spanish variation, bishop to b5. He plays the pawn to a6, and usually we retreat to a4 with the bishop. But me, I'm going to take the knight. I'm going to play the exchange variation of the Spanish. It was a variation often played by the former world champion, Bobby Fischer. The opponent recaptures with the pawn from d7 to c6. And here, I can't really win the pawn on e5 because there will be the counterattack queen to d4, which will attack the knight and the pawn. So I'm going to kingside castling. And here, my opponent plays the pawn to f6 because I was really threatening to take the pawn. Because after queen d4, I could have retreated. And after queen e4, rook e1, and it would have been in a pin. So that's why he plays f6 and defends the pawn. You can defend with the bishop, with the queen, but the pawn on f6 is perfectly possible. Yet this move looks like a beginner's move. And it's true that most of the time in the opening, f6 to defend e5 is not good. But in this variation, it's possible. Why? Because advancing this pawn opens up white diagonals. But I no longer have a bishop on the white squares. My opponent still has theirs. And so it's less critical for my opponent to open the white squares since I wouldn't necessarily be able to take advantage of it. So I can still play. Knight takes, pawn takes, queen check, which will allow me to win back the pawn on 5. But this variation is not winning for white. One might think this is very good, but analysis actually shows that it's not such a clear position and that black can get out of it. So I'm not going to play this variation. Instead, I'll play d4. I'm attacking the pawn on 5. So it's true that I don't have a bishop on the white square, so I don't have the pair of bishops, but I have a better pawn structure. The pawn has captured, I'll recapture with the queen. He takes knight, recaptures. And the knight comes to e7. So now you understand, I have to attack on the black squares. I don't have a bishop on the white square, so I need to consolidate on the white squares and attack the black squares. But the black squares, how do you attack them? Well, the pawn on c7 is completely defenseless. I could play bishop to f4 to attack it, by the way. So he developed his knight to e7 because he couldn't put it on f6 and didn't want to go to h6, because any possible captures would have further damaged his pawn structure. That's why he put the knight on e7. But as a result, after bishop to f4, he's no longer able to play bishop to d6 to defend his pawn. And so the king will have to move to defend it, but that's still a bit awkward, especially since I could put the rook in front of his king. So I'm going to immediately start the fight on the dark squares by attacking the pawn on c7. So my strategy is to really consolidate on the light squares, for example, by playing the pawn to f3, the pawn to c4, the pawn to b3, having chains of pawns that will prevent his light squared bishop from finding diagonals, but also prevent his knight from finding the squares. Then to attack on the dark squares. Now he plays c5, he attacks my knight, and that's what he found. He thinks that as a result, my knight will move, and that afterwards he'll have time to save his pawn on c7 and move it to c6. But here, I'm going to play knight b3 to attack his pawn on c5. So the pawn could still advance to c4 anyway. But there could be a move like knight a5 to attack the pawn c4 and steal the pawn c7. So here, I'm looking at knight b3. I'm also checking if there are any other moves, but I think I'm going to play knight b3. Let's go knight b3, the pawn c5, the pawn c7. He plays the pawn to c4. So here I have either knight f5 or knight d2. And I think I'm going to play knight d2, because knight f5, if I play b5, sure, I win the pawn on c7. But then my knight has no square. I have to be very careful. All the squares are controlled by black. It doesn't have a retreat square. So I'm going to play knight to d2 instead. If he pushes the pawn to c3, of course I'll recapture with the knight and not the pawn. I'm not going to destroy the pawn structure. So I'm attacking the pawn on c4 and the pawn on c7. He plays c6, and now it's going to be double trouble for him, because not only does he lose the pawn, but by playing c6, now he's given me all the dark squares. I have the b6 square, the d6 square with the bishop on the dark squares. So sure, my opponent has a bishop on the light squares. He has the pair of bishops. But me, I'm going to play moves like f3. I'm going to consolidate on the light squares, no problem. But I have an extra piece to play on the dark squares. And since he's putting his pawns on the light squares, well, with my extra piece, I'll be able to dominate the dark squares and infiltrate his camp. So knight takes c4, and you see I'm threatening knight to d6. Check, knight to b6. He won't be able to hold the dark squares. It's not possible. He still plays king g6 to attack my bishop on the dark squares. So I still look at nb6. He takes my bishop. I take his rook. And normally my knight has 2 squares to escape because it's fun. After knight b6, he plays rook a7, bishop b8. And you see how his rook got trapped? Look at the dark squares. So knight b6, he takes my bishop, I take his rook, I win the exchange, and normally I manage to get my knight out on the dark squares. I need to be sure that I can actually do it. Maybe it's not so obvious, actually. Let's imagine he plays the pawn to b5. My knight, even if it comes to b6, won't be able to get out again. All the squares are controlled, the white squares. And if I play knight c7, check, he will come to attack my knight, and my knight will not have a retreat square. So there, I think that in reality, knight b6, it doesn't work. Knight b6, knight takes bishop, knight takes rook, and there, b5. And whether I go to b6 or c7 with check, my knight doesn't have a square to retreat to afterwards. So as a result, I think either I pull back the bishop to g3, or I play knight d6, check. He'll play bishop takes, that helps him develop a bit, so maybe bishop to g3. He still has the problem with his rook, but maybe he'll be able to solve it now. Listen, I'll play bishop to g3, let's see. So I'm threatening king b6, rook i7, bishop b8. But now it's not my move anymore. He plays bishop c5, he's coming to control the square b6. But there's also this square d6, which is very interesting for me as well. Maybe I should have played immediately king to d6 check, actually. And if I play bishop 4, what will he play? If he does bishop takes pawn, king bishop 6. And I managed to get him into the sequence I wanted. On the other hand, after bishop 4, he can play bishop d4, but I can play c3. And then he'll have to retreat to a 7. And I'll have knight d6 check. That's interesting. Look at the move before. I'm trying to divert his bishop from protecting the b6 square. So after bishop takes knight b6, rook a7, bishop b8, and I managed to trap his rook. Maybe the best for him is to play bishop as well, actually, and to counterattack without my white knight. That could be interesting for him, because if I take his bishop on the black square, he takes my knight, he attacks my rook. Well, my rook can move, I can still do it. But he retreats to a 7. And now he no longer controls that d6 square, so I can play knight d6 check. And where will his king go? If he comes to the d file, rook d1, of course. On king d6, he'll have to go to f8 or e7. Do I have any other interesting moves? Bishop d6, maybe? He's going to play against me. b5. King d5. I attack the pawn c6, but I'm not sure that's good. Let's play knight d6, check. He plays king to f8. If I were him, I would have put the king on a7 to be able to slide the rook. But maybe on e7, he was afraid of checks from the knight, but he could have played bishop takes. So I think he could have put his king on e7. I don't know why he went to f8. And now I'm going to develop the other knight. Maybe knight d2, knight c4. Not knight c3. The knight doesn't have a square on knight c3. Knight d2. Maybe we can go to c4 to keep the protection of d6. On b5, maybe go to a5, attack the pawn c6, maybe things like that. All right, I'll play knight d2. That blocks the play a bit on the d file, but the knight wants to come to c4 anyway. He plays bishop d4. He's attacking my rook. But in any case, my rook was planning to move. I'm even considering leaving my rook there. Because if he takes my rook, I recapture, but he won't have a bishop on a black square anymore. And I'll have 3 minor pieces to play on the dark squares. That can sometimes be interesting. For example, knight c4, bishop takes, rook recaptures. And afterwards, I'll be threatening some moves, like knight b6, you see. But, well, he'll have time to play. b5. But still, after b5, knight takes on b6, I attack his rook and I attack his bishop twice, so he's still losing a piece. That could be interesting. Knight takes on c4, bishop takes, rook takes. And I threaten to arrive on b6. But he's going to move his bishop, I don't know, bishop e6, for example. Knight takes on b6, his rook lacks squares, but still it can go to d8. And that's a good square for him. Even if after that he loses the pawn on b7, I think there's still play. But still, there's not really any reason to give up the rook. I think I'm going to play rook to d1 anyway. All right, rook to d1. If he plays bishop to e5, maybe knight to c4. He plays bishop to c3, he attacks the pawn and the knight, but the knight is defended. So I'm checking. Knight c4, bishop b4, knight b6. Let's play it like that. After bishop 4, knight 6, he can't play bishop takes knight, recapturing with check, then taking his rook. For now, we haven't heard anything from these white squares, and we can see the black squares. You see, all the squares where he has weakened himself are on black squares. And since I have 3 minor pieces to play on the black squares and he only has 2 to defend them, well, obviously I have a numerical advantage. He has weakened himself on the color where he was already outnumbered. So it's dramatic. So here the rook is under attack. In addition to that, the bishop. My bishop controls the b8 square. If the rook comes at some point to b8, but even on a7, it would fall victim to a bishop on b8. So he takes, but bishop takes check. He loses the rook and he will inevitably have to resign. We'll see. Maybe he won't resign right away. But I hope he will have learned the game of colors. And look, I'm blocking on the white squares and his bishop on white squares can't touch me. He's still going to come to e6 to attack the pawn. He's always attacking my knight. So my knight is going to move out, most likely to b6, even though I need to consider the consequences of c7, but he just resigned anyway. So I have 96% accuracy versus 84%, but let's look at the opening to see where things started to go wrong for him. So I play the pawn to e4, my opponent plays e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5, the Spanish opening. He plays the pawn to a6, I go for the exchange variation, and here, kingside castling. Now I'm threatening knight takes on e5. Then you might think that f6 is a beginner's move, but in reality, it's practically the main move played by grandmasters. So he can play f6 because the sequence knight takes, pawn takes, queen to h5. Check doesn't actually work well. The king comes to d7. Sure, I can take the pawn on d5, but he can play queen e7 to propose the exchange of the queens. His king is uncastled. I've won 2 pawns, but he has an extra piece. And the computer indicates that it's an advantage for black, and in reality, grandmasters with white don't go for this line. So f6 is entirely possible. He can also come and pin my knight on f3 with bishop g4. And after h3, play the trap with h5. And here I absolutely must not take because the pawn will recapture, chasing away my knight and opening the file with the rook and queen, who will team up to try to checkmate me. So in this position, you absolutely must not take. You should try to play d3, develop the knight. You should try to develop your game and wait to capture under better circumstances. For example, if at some point black play moves like knight to f6 or bishop to e7, that will prevent the queen from coming to h4, and then you can start to capture. There are also moves like bishop to d6 or queen to d6 to defend the pawn, but each time you play d4. So here, he played bishop to f6, and I played d4. He takes on d4, and that's where I made an inaccuracy. And actually, when I played it, I felt a bit uncomfortable because I realized that I hadn't played the line I knew, the one from Bobby Fischer. You have to recapture with the knight on d4. But I recaptured with the queen. I played a bit too quickly at that moment. The best move for white is to recapture with the knight. Of course, black can still exchange queens. Black plays c5, we play knight to b3, and there can be an exchange of queens. And we play out this position. And you see, if the bishop from the white square comes to attack us, we play f3 to reinforce. Then afterwards, we start attacking the black squares. For example, moves like bishop to e3, bishop to f4 to attack the pawns on the black square. There are also ideas if black play b6 like a 4, a 5 to try to break through. Or who had left 3 knights against 4 to attack. You'll need to try to break up the black squares. There's a famous game like this between Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky during their rematch in 1992. Fischer had practically won in the opening. Well, at the very start of the middle game, he won this position even though there was no queen. He really crushed Boris Spassky in this variation. But as for me, as you saw in the position, I recaptured with the queen. That's a bit less good. So he exchanges the queens, that's true. And here black should simply play bishop to d7 and queenside castling. Then afterwards, lock down the dark squares with b6, c5, a5, place the bishop, for example, on the long white diagonal, since the knight will be pushed back, and play the position like that. It's true that the structure of the black pawns is a bit inferior with the doubled pawns, but there is still the pair of bishops. But here my opponent makes a mistake. He played a bit too quickly. He plays knight to e7. He doesn't want to develop his knight to f6. He doesn't want to put it on h6, maybe because of the bishop. First we take, which definitively breaks his pawn structure, completely ruining his pawn structure. And so he is going to develop it to e7, maybe planning to jump to g6, then for example the square e5, or maybe c5, then the square c6. But as a result, bishop to f4, and he can no longer defend the pawn on c7. Now the computer says that the best way to play is still to play king d8 with black, but we don't want to put the king on that file. Even though actually after king d8, rook d1, black can play bishop d7, and maybe then have ideas of c5 to push back the knight b6, and then maneuver with the king c8, king b7, put it on a light square, let the rook slide over. It's a bit acrobatic, but black might still manage to complete their development this way. But in the position, he played c5, so I retreat to attack the pawn on c5. He plays c4, so I fall back to d2. And now he's going to have to give up one of the pawns. Unfortunately for him, he plays c6, so he gives me the pawn, c4, but the absence of his pawn on c7 is going to cause him a lot of problems. Certainly, the pawn c7 is no longer a pawn that is targeted, no longer a victim, but on the other hand, it no longer holds the squares b6 or d6, and as you've seen, there will be constant penetrations on its squares. And that was decisive in the game. He ended up losing material because of it. Because in the position where I have 3 minor pieces, you see the 2 knights and the bishop able to play on the dark squares. My opponent only has 2. He has the bishop on a light square, but the bishop on light squares can't defend the dark squares. So if he puts his pawns on light squares with his bishop on light squares, I'll be able to infiltrate on the dark squares. And by getting into his position, I'll be able to attack pieces and win material, just like what happened in the game. You can leave me likes, comments, and share the video. And we'll meet again soon for new adventures on the chessboards. Goodbye, everyone.